Hello, breadfiesta here. Recently, I began a quest to complete the video games in my queue. At the start of the summer, I had 64 games to complete. Since then, I've added another 2 and beaten only 2, for a total of 64 games still. So, not great progress, especially since the most recent game took me over 2.5 months to complete. Tales of Vesperia Definitive Edition for the Nintendo Switch. Tales of Vesperia is a 2008 action RPG developed and published by Namco Bandai. Originally released for the Xbox 360 and eventually ported and enhanced for the PS3, PS4, Xbone, Switch, and Steam for PC. The story follows Yuri, an underachieving former knight from the lower quarter with dubious moral code, and Estelle, a cloistered princess seeking to save the people outside the castle. The cast of characters joining the party also includes Carol, the young guild leader, Rita, the scientist wizard, and only character that matters, Judith, an elf-like Critian with mysterious objectives, Raven, guild member / war veteran / anime old, so like late 20s, Patty, an amnesiac pirate, Flynn, the paladin knight captain, and Rapide, a dog. The story is told in 3 acts, with the conflicts escalating in magnitude, starting with local issues including theft in the capital, moving to the collapse of the whole empire, and finally facing the fate of the whole world with an impending apocalypse. Vesperia is one of many in the Tales of series of video games. It features a new battle system differing from the Tales games prior, and it would be built upon in the games following. Vesperia is often regarded, if not the best in the whole series, then at least in the top 2. The game's legacy is honestly challenging for me. Despite having over 170 hours of playtime, including the main story and some of the post-game, honestly, I would rate this game as a 4 out of 10. Which seems like a lot of playtime for a game that I considered less than average. But it met my threshold for keeping my interest throughout the story, so I figured I would still finish it. But if I didn't enjoy the best that the series had to offer, would I enjoy any of the other Tales games? This was a series that I was interested in for a long time, and having received this one as a gift, I wanted to dip my toe in the pool. So knowing that my opinion went against the legacy that the game holds within the community, I thought maybe there's something that I overlooked that would improve my opinion of the game. And this was a question that followed me even from when I started the game to when I finished it. I was asking this myself several times over the course of the playthrough. What am I missing about Tales of Vesperia? Couple of administrative notes before we get started with this discussion. First off, spoilers ahead for Tales of Vesperia, obviously. We'll also be discussing some other action RPG games that I played in comparison to this one, specifically Ni no Kuni 2 and Trials of Mana, the remake for the PS4. I'll start by going through kind of my experience from the start, kind of the first third of the game, and then dig into some of the specific points where I felt that my experience was lacking in some way. Because I really do, over the course of this video, want to get to that key point of really what am I missing about this game? What is everybody seeing or feeling or experiencing about this game that I'm just not? So, I'm not sure if this counts as a review of the game. This is really just an exercise, a post-mortem, if you will, of having played the game myself and sharing my experiences. So if this helps you decide whether you want to play Tales of Vesperia or not, great. If you're somebody who enjoys Tales of Vesperia and finds my critique and discussion of the game to be infuriating or offensive, then that's you are welcome to say so. And I will, again, try to keep an open mind and try to figure out what I am missing about Tales of Vesperia, and if there is something that maybe would take me to a score higher than 4 out of 10. And I don't think it's the last post-game dungeon that I didn't do, just based on what I have read already. So here we go. The game starts slow, with Yuri exploring the castle solo while investigating a theft. There are a couple of tutorials teaching you the battle mechanics, and I started to notice something odd. The battles seemed very difficult. I nearly failed the first tutorial, which was a 1v2 handicap battle, and I felt that I wasn't able to focus on one enemy without the other one beating me up. I felt that it was strangely challenging, and it immediately, between that and then a lot of the early game battles, which I felt probably should have been trivial Rattata level battles, I felt like I was taking a lot of damage. And I had to ask myself, am I missing something here? Is there something that I'm doing or playing incorrectly? So I went online to seek advice. And of course, the infinitely compassionate wisdom of gamers online provided me the solution to my problem.
Get good, loser.
Other, more helpful people instead suggested that the game starts slow and eases up after more characters join your party. And that seemed to be true. My patience was rewarded when Estelle, who is a healer, joined the party. It mitigated the difficulty of handicap battles, having a second character on the battlefield, as well as my concerns about damage taken with Estelle being able to heal with a fairly cheap spell. And then there were the bosses. The very first boss of the game is Zagi, who is some sort of assassin. We'll talk about Zagi later. The online forums suggested that a couple of the early game bosses could be referred to as noob killers. This turned out to be true. I struggled with Zagi quite a bit. Eventually I beat him after a few tries. After the battle, I was even presented with a message that said, "Secret mission complete." I had no idea what this meant, which is fair. It's fair that I didn't know about the secret missions because they are secret. But it led to a question, which is, what else could I be missing here? I looked up the secret missions and found that there were 25 of them, one for each boss in the main story. 5 of them would end up being Zagi battles, which again, we will talk about Zagi later. I have a lot of thoughts about Zagi. Some of these secret missions are alluded to during story events. For example, a flower that stuns the party as they're walking through a forest, and then you have to use that flower on the battlefield to stun the boss. Other secret missions seem to be completely random, though, to the point where it feels like you need to follow a guide to know about them. And secret missions were not the only thing where I felt you needed to follow a guide. Tales of Vesperia is loaded with a ton of side quests and extra content beyond the main plot. But the game does not actively tell you about any of them. If you're not following a guide or being very thorough and brute forcing your way, talking to every single NPC after every single story event, you're likely to miss something. There's no bomber's notebook or any sort of way to keep track of these side quests or when there are characters to speak to, where they are, and what they need you to do in order to trigger these new events. Now, the bomber's notebook is from Majora's Mask, and Zelda games are not quite in the same genre as an action RPG like Tales of Vesperia. But for the sake of comparing similar oranges to oranges, let's say, I would like to compare the side quests in Tales of Vesperia to the side quests in another action RPG, Ni no Kuni 2, which is a game that I very much enjoyed. Ni no Kuni 2 has a number of side quests as well, and for the most part, they're all cataloged either in the menus, in terms of the villagers that you can recruit, or they're marked on the map when you make them active. For Tales of Vesperia, though, without having this cataloging feature, I found that every play session would start with me pulling up a guide. Actually, 3 guides. One for all the side quests, one for all the secret missions, and one for all the costumes, even though costumes wouldn't be available until well into the second act of the game. I started pulling up the guide about 10 hours into the game, and as I was reading through it, I realized that I had already missed 2 things. First, I had failed to use the fighting lens to tattle the tutorial enemies in that very first battle of the game. This meant that my monster book, or bestiary, would be incomplete, locking me out of a collectible, in this case a title, for one of the characters. Second, I had failed to refrain from using items in battle for the entire first act of the story. I had used items in battle by this point, which would then also lock me out of one of these collectible titles. Now, you may have realized that these 2 tasks are actually contradictory. You can't tattle the enemies in the game using the fighting lens and also not use items in-game. What this means is that in order to complete everything in the game, which I wanted to do as a completionist, that is how Breadfiesta Enterprises works, we 100% games, and please don't look for any of the myriad counterexamples that can be found on my channel. But to complete this game fully, as I intended to from the start, I would need to both restart the game, which I was unwilling to do, having already invested 10 hours, and I would need to play the game twice to get both of these tasks. And I could already tell that replaying the game was going to be a struggle for me. Reading online, other gamers had shared that the game's replayability was one of its strongest aspects. Using a resource called Grade, which we had been collecting throughout the game by completing battles skillfully, you can make a second playthrough more fun and efficient by increasing experience gain, increasing money gain, carrying over your items and titles and costumes from the previous playthrough, for example. And as an aside, Grade was another thing that made me ask if I was missing something. When you complete a battle, the fanfare screen lists like 10 different categories of, and that's not even counting all of the items that the items that the enemies drop. There was a lot of things that you get, not just experience, but also learning points, which you use to learn skills, as well as the grade that you collect. There's some bonus category that I don't know what it means. It's a lot. You are constantly presented with a lot of information at once. And it just made me ask, like, is there something else I'm missing, or did I miss something about grade? Because as far as I could tell, there was no tutorial or help file or anything in-game that would tell me how grade worked. I had to look that up online. This seemed to be a design choice. The game seemed to be built for multiple playthroughs, with the first playthrough perhaps being intended as a casual playthrough, not really going for completionist. And this design choice kind of frustrated me, because if the second playthrough was potentially going to be more enjoyable, why did I need to struggle through the first? And there were a few areas where I struggled. Most prominently came in the form of the battle system. As an RPG, even as an action RPG, the battle system is kind of the bread and butter of the game. This is where you're spending most of your time. And boy, did I spend a lot of time in the battle system. You have 9 party members, 4 of which participate in battle at any given time. Each of the party members has their own unique playstyle. Starting the game, I played as Yuri, mostly because he was the only character that was available, and because he was the protagonist. But I found the cooldown between his combos to be very challenging to work around. I would complete a 3-hit combo, and then he would have to cool down using a cool flip of his sword, where he would get hit by whatever enemy didn't die from the combo. Or if there were multiple enemies that he'd aggroed, they would just storm in on him. So I found that challenging. After Rita joined the party, I tried using her, because she was a magic user, which is different from my usual playstyle, and I wanted to try something different. And also, she shared the same voice actor with my favorite anime character. But I found that even her most basic spells took way too long to charge, and since her aim didn't adjust while she was casting, enemies would inevitably just move out of the way and her spells would miss all the time. As new party members joined, I enjoyed playing as Judith, Rapide, and Patty for their faster-paced playstyles. But I ultimately switched back and settled with Rita after we unlocked the light magic skill. This skill reduced both casting time and TP usage, TP being the mana resource of the game. This allowed her spells to be cast more rapidly and allowed her to hit her targets more consistently. Like other action RPGs, or RPGs in general, Tales of Vesperia throws in a lot of battle mechanics in order to make the whole system unique. There's basic things like TP management and elemental weaknesses and combos, which you're supposedly expected to get hundreds of combos strung together, but I never figured out how to do that. There's also Party AI, which allows you to control the 3 other party members joining you on the field. And you can apparently control that to an incredibly granular level, but the game does not tell you how to do that. It's like the grade resource, it's not in the help files anywhere. And people were alluding to it online, and I just had no clue where that was. I found it myself, and it was helpful, but the game should have told you about it, I feel. There's also Fatal Strikes, which allow you to either one-shot a random enemy or do massive damage to a boss. They also add an entirely new element on top of your attacks, so an attack could be both fire element and up Fatal Strike, or red Fatal Strike, I guess. No, red was blue. Red was down. Blue was up. In any event, it's another thing that you have to pay attention to, and I largely ignored it until I'd settled with Light Magic Rita, because even with her Light Magic skill, it was still frustrating to consistently get those Fatal Strikes. There was also Overlimit, which allowed you to go into a short Super Saiyan mode, and I never used it until the post-game because I am simple, and the battle mechanics were already far too complex. Ultimately, I just ended up so weary of the battle system by the end of the game. Late game and post-game enemies just had so much HP that battles took forever even using the Fatal Strikes. Bosses especially just took far too long to defeat. Notably was the final boss of the post-game dungeon, the Necropolis of Nostalgia, which was also known as the Telescopic Graveyard in the original version. And I feel like I have to mention that because some people don't like the new name, and whatever. That boss took me 45 minutes to defeat, which is a lot of time. And that was playing on normal difficulty with all of my party members at max level. The boss had 1 million HP, and it felt like we were just chipping it down the whole time, and it kept reviving. It was a 3-headed chimera with 2 tails and a body that each had their own HP bars, and as you would take out one, the center head would just resurrect the other parts, and it was just it didn't even seem like it was particularly hard, it was just long. That was the real challenge of it. And the post-game mentioning the Necropolis of Nostalgia, it seems to just be battle gauntlets. I'd read praise for the Necropolis online for all of the story content that it adds, but I really didn't feel like there was any, which again made me think, like, did I miss something as I was going through this dungeon? I thought I was pretty thorough. I explored every single floor, and outside of the battle gauntlets, each floor was completely empty. And 2/3 of the dungeon, there's 6 different kind of towers, I guess you can think of them, and towers 3 through 6 have no story content whatsoever. you enter the third tower and then you just keep going until you get to the final boss of the area at the end of the sixth tower. And I really was feeling like I was missing something, because I had read people praise the story content that the post game added, and I was like, where is it? Where did I miss it? I'm really in the weeds with this game, and I really want to know what I am missing. What did I miss about this game? And the whole battle gauntlet system, I don't understand the fascination with pit challenges. I have enjoyed the game. Speaking now, comparing to RPGs more broadly, I have played a decent amount of them. One of them being Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which has the Pit of 100 Trials, which people enjoy a lot because they like the battle system in the game. But the Pit of 100 Trials, to me, so boring. And this is coming from somebody who watches a lot of Paper Mario Black Pit and TTYD Infinite Pit content on YouTube, and I enjoy it largely because of the personalities. But I just, the nonstop battle gauntlets, they just don't do anything for me, especially in a game like Tales of Vesperia, where I was already feeling that the battle system was not good. I guess not good for me. And if we're going to continue our comparison to other games, which I'm now realizing that I missed this entire page when I was last reading the script. So this is great. But comparing it to other games, specifically in the action RPG, Trials of Mana was a game that I played and did not enjoy as much, largely because I didn't carry over any of this nostalgia because I'd never played the original version. And Trials of Mana, I struggled with the battle system pretty much solely because of the camera controls. So, for what it's worth, Tales of Vesperia has a better camera system than Trials of Mana. But in general, it just feels so much slower than Trials of Mana or Ni no Kuni 2. And I think it's because of the fanfare that precludes every battle. Every time you engage in a battle, even within a dungeon, you're taken to a separate battlefield, self-contained, and you have the fanfare that starts the battle and then the rewards after. And I feel that that's different from Trials of Mana in the entire game, both in the dungeons and in the overworld-esque areas, and Ni no Kuni 2 in the dungeon specifically, where you engage in a battle and it just takes place. It defines a battlefield around the hallways or the platforms in the dungeon that you're in, and you fight the enemy and then continue on your way. So it doesn't feel like there's that disruption of the flow, which is a good segue to, I guess, talking about the world design. The world of Tales of Vesperia is pretty large. Each of the cities and dungeons has a unique feel, and probably the worst part about it is the battles, because they just interrupt the flow and interrupt your exploration of these areas. And sometimes you just have to be there for grinding for crafting resources or filling up the monster book. The dungeons are often sprawling and labyrinthian, and both the main story and the side quests will often take you to these dungeons multiple times. They each will have puzzles or some sort of gimmick that you need to figure out in order to complete the dungeon and reach either your goal or reach the other side to exit. But because you end up visiting these dungeons multiple times, the second and later visits, the puzzles have already been cleared. So it feels often like they're just fetch quests where you're returning to these areas and just walking through interrupted hallways, fighting these battles, or in the case of the post-game with the Necropolis of Nostalgia, uninterrupted empty hallways devoid of story content. Where is it? And talking about side quests, there is a lot of, I guess, mini games or other little things you can do beyond just battles, which I do appreciate. Some of them being better implemented than others. But we have, for example, block pushing warehouse puzzles, luck mini games like the Dice Master game, marking your territory on the dog map, working as a waiter, playing 5-card stud, and dog snowboarding. And of those, probably the weakest of them are the dog map and the dog snowboarding. With the dog map being frustrating to catalog, especially for, even if it was a game released in 2008, it's 2021. Make that better. You don't need to defer to how it used to be. You can improve that. And then dog snowboarding, which just felt out of place and probably was not as challenging as I needed to make it out to be, because the I guess the thresholds by which you unlock new costumes are actually a lot more forgiving than they seem. And each of those mini games that I mentioned, they all are to unlock new costumes and new collectible titles for the characters. So it is, again, like I mentioned with the side quest before, there's no way to keep track of what you've done or what you still have to do, so you have to keep track of that outside of the game. And it's just another thing where you might miss out on things. Hello, it's me, Breadfiesta from the future, while I'm editing the video. I realized that there was one entire area about the game that I did not talk about. Something that has become increasingly important to me as I play video games, and that's the music. As I was editing, I was picking out music to play in the background of the video, since I don't have actual video to play. And I realized that I don't like the music in the game. And that might be a significant part of why I didn't enjoy the game so much. There's not a whole lot of tracks that I find to be very good, especially the battle music for the third act of the game. I think that's probably why the battle system got so weary, was because I didn't like the music. And that third act battle music plays during the whole post-game as well. And since the post-game is all battle gauntlets, you're listening to that music a lot, and I don't like it. And I'm really starting to think that the lack of really good music in the game might have been that significant. That piece that I was missing in my experience of the game. Because even the last game that I played in my queue, Blue Reflection, I gave a 5 out of 10, and I at least really enjoyed the music. There was a comment recently on that video that reminded me that I did enjoy that music quite a bit, and I don't feel that way about Tales of Vesperia. I ended up, as I was editing the video, just listening to music from other games, because listening to the music from Tales of Vesperia was a negative experience for me. So this didn't come out during the discussion as I was having it, but as I was listening back to it, that seemed significant enough to call out that the lack of good music. And not to say that there aren't some that are acceptable, like the fight against Jaeger is pretty good. I really do like that music. And then the minigame music is kind of goofy. The Act 1 battle music is probably the best of all of them. So there are some that are okay, but it's not like Blue Reflection, where the music was really good, or RFL or Bravely Default, especially not Bravely Default, where the music put that game over as my number one game of all time. The music was not great. So maybe that's it. I don't know. The world is very well populated. In addition to your cast of 9 characters in your party, there are a lot of NPCs that either assist or seek to harm you throughout the game. And the side quests do a fair job of building the personalities of not only your main characters, but those NPCs. I mentioned Yuri's dubious moral code, and that is kind of interesting as that code evolves throughout the story. Yuri is seen as one of the more popular protagonists and is often referred to as why people like Tales of Vesperia so much, is that he is this kind of vigilante sort of character, a anti-hero who will do things that are pretty, like I said, morally dubious and outright bad for the sake of the greater good. In fact, the first time that he does a murder is pretty shocking. And then he does it again. And it seems like it's affecting his personality, it's affecting his relationships with the rest of the party, and that there's going to be consequences with those other characters, especially once they discover that he has murdered two of the antagonists of the game. But then it just doesn't matter. Like, once the rest of the party finds out that Yuri has been murdering people, they have their discussions about it, and it just doesn't seem to... None of the other characters seem to care. They're just okay with what Yuri's done, and Yuri maintains his kind of new dark attitude and the scowl on his face, but everybody else just says, oh, that's just Yuri, that's just who he is. And you think it would raise issues with his best friend, the Paladin Knight Captain, who, were he in Flynn's jurisdiction, Yuri would be arrested and imprisoned for the rest of his life. But it just seems to be fine. Another character does try to do a murder on Yuri, but it's not because of all the murders that he did. She's just jealous of him, and ultimately that doesn't really seem to affect things anyway. It's more of just like we need to push the plot into the third act. Here's something pretty shocking that would be a cliffhanger if this was 3 separate games. I mentioned how the conflicts in the story seem to escalate to the point where the third act focuses on more of a man versus nature level conflict. I'd also mentioned that Rita is the only character that matters. And I said that it sounded like a joke, but it's not. Rita is the only scientist and proper magic user in the party. And as a scientist, she understands the world, and in a conflict that is, man versus nature, the character who best understands the world and best understands nature is going to be the best to explain what is going on. And Rita plays this role throughout the entire game, where she is the only character who really understands what is happening with the technology and the air or the mana throughout the world, the monsters and the Entelecheia, the big monsters and the spirits. She's the only character who gets it, and she's surrounded by all of these brutish oafs in the party who they're good at swinging a sword. And when we reach the final boss and he's completing his monologue, he actually singles out Rita, and it only really interacts with her because she's the only one who really gets what he's doing. For what it's worth, the story in the third act is basically an allegory for the climate crisis that we are currently going through, which I thought that was pretty neat. But it just was interesting that she's really the only character that matters in the story. All the other characters do have their moments, and they have their own lessons to learn and stories to tell. And that goes for the NPCs as well, who help contribute to those. So why would I mention Zagi in particular? Why would I call out Zagi? You fight Zagi 5 times throughout the game, and with 5 appearances, Zagi appears more frequently than a lot of other NPCs. And his motivations are unclear. He starts off as an assassin wanting to fight and presumably kill Flynn, but it's not clear why he's doing it or who he is working for. He then shows up throughout the rest of the game before major story events or other bosses, playing a sort of junior troopa sort of role, where he seeks to fight Yuri because Yuri gives him a good fight. Additionally, he is a crazy person, so the party never bothers asking any of these questions because they just know that they won't get a straight answer. But as the player, you have these questions and you want to know about his loyalties and what his role actually is in the story. Is he working for Barbas the pirate? Is he working for the Hunting Blades? Is he working for Jaeger or Alexei? Who is supplying him with the technology? He is slowly, as we fight him, his body is becoming weaker and he's supplementing it with technology. Who's giving him that technology that is turning him into an android? It's definitely not the final boss, because the final boss is anti-technology. He's trying to bring about the apocalypse and eliminate all human life because technology is bad. So it definitely isn't him. And yet, the last time we fight Zagi is on Tarkaron, which is the final area of the world, or final area of the game, which is a giant floating castle that is explicitly stated to be too high up in the air for anyone to reach other than our flying dragon, which has been escorting us around the world. So how did Zagi get up there? Like, was he in Tarkaron prior to it lifting into the sky? Was he on our boat? Did somebody bring him up there with the express goal of stopping us? Who gave him the robot arm and the robot voice modulation? I'm so in the weeds with Zagi because I'm so disappointed in how his character is treated, and his existence in the story is almost the manifestation of my question of what am I missing about this game? After you fight him the 5th time, Yuri murders him. He just kills him and throws him off the side of the castle. We don't get any answers about who he was working for or where his loyalties were. He just dies. He's mentioned very, very briefly in the Necropolis of Nostalgia as having a similar hairstyle to the ghosts that live in that area, suggesting that he is also a child of the full moon like Estelle. But, like, what are the implications of that? Is what I asked as a player, and then the game doesn't talk about him ever again. They mention that, they throw it in there as like a fun flavor thing, but then they just drop it. And it's like, but why? Why though? What am I missing here? What? It just felt like such a disconnect. And it just seems so indicative again of my feelings about feeling like I've missed something. Feeling like I am missing something. I feel like I'm missing something in the battle system because I'm not enjoying it. I always feel like I'm missing something in the world because there's always stuff to do and stuff that I missed at the beginning of the game, which I would then need to play the game again. And maybe the second playthrough will be faster because I've collected a lot of grade, so I'll be able to increase my experience. And you can get to max level within the course of a couple hours just by getting like a good critical moment boost from Patty. So that helped, but even then being at max level doesn't seem to help for a lot of the bosses. I just, the battles, I was missing something. The world, I'm always missing something. The characters are missing something. There's always a side quest where you're missing something. I'm just, what am I missing about Tales of Vesperia that is in the 6 points out of 10 that I didn't give it? Is it something that's in the other Tales games that maybe I would enjoy more? Or is it just that the Tales series of games is not for me? Because I shared, like, I like action RPGs. I really did enjoy Ni no Kuni 2, and I put a lot of effort into that, especially in the post-game stuff, which was all battles, but I still felt like I could enjoy it. And I even was feeling like I wanted to go back to Trials of Mana, even though I felt like I struggled with that game, but I just felt like I would have enjoyed it more than Tales of Vesperia. So I don't think it's that action RPGs aren't for me. Maybe it's just that the Tales series isn't for me. And that's disappointing. And if there's something that I'm missing, I would like to know what it is, because this discussion didn't tell me what it was. What am I missing about Tales of Vesperia? I don't know. Thank you very much for listening. I have been breadfiesta, and I hope your day is going exactly the way that you want it to.